One of the easiest ways to completely ruin and derail your spiritual practices and your spiritual path is to approach the path with an incredibly mundane state of mind and with a mundane relationship to the spiritual path, where we pursue it in a way that itself leads to a kind of spiritual materialism, a kind of worldly way of approaching something that's supposed to be very sacred. And in today's episode, we are going to look at some of the problems and issues surrounding that, what it's done for modern spirituality, how it's changed the way that spirituality is presented, as well as how best we can kind of counter this in our own daily practice. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel to keep up with all of our new content. Thank you and enjoy. It is not only possible, but incredibly common for practitioners to approach their spiritual path, whether it's Buddhism, Taoism, yoga, some other system that's new or have just been come up with. It's quite common for people to approach their path, to approach their methods with an incredibly mundane way of thinking about the entire spiritual process. One of the reasons for this, of course, is because that's really the only mode of thinking most people have had their whole life. They're used to thinking about things in an incredibly reward and almost economic-oriented way. We can't help it. We end up seeing everything as being an investment. What kind of return are we going to get on our investment? How much time is this going to take? How much am I going to get out of it for the time that I put into it? Exactly how long do I need to do this before I get these results and those results? Exactly how long will realization take? Or how long will it take to awaken the Kundalini? What's the best way? How do I get the most bang for my buck? All of this is this incredibly kind of materialistic and incredibly almost economic-driven way of thinking about the spiritual path that produces just a very mundane relationship with something that's supposed to be opening up a kind of sacred dimension of life to us. And it can't possibly do that. We can't begin to kind of tap into anything that might be called sacred, anything that might be considered in some way not the same as our normal worldly experiences, but maybe of a slightly higher nature. We can't begin to relate with that if we continue to try to explore it and work with it in a way that's very mundane and actually quite contrary to the nature of the path. In other words, to approach something spiritual in an incredibly mundane way makes it not spiritual anymore, right? The intent, the approach is actually one of the things that's the driving power behind the methods, the practices, the prayers, the meditation. If we approach meditation with a mundane mind is what we're going to get out of it. If we approach meditation or any spiritual work with a sense of doership, with a sense of ego-driven, reward-driven value systems that are occupying our mind, then that's going to end up handicapping us, and we're just going to get something incredibly mundane out of our spiritual tradition and out of our practice, as opposed to anything that resembles something sacred. Mundane results are simple things that actually many people find beneficial at times, right? People pursue spirituality because it can be very therapeutic, and so they want to get a therapeutic reward from it, even though spirituality far transcends basic aspects of therapy. And in many ways, I would prefer if practitioners just went and got therapy from licensed professionals. I think actually a lot of practitioners could benefit from that. Most people could benefit from it, whether they're on the path or not. But people, they approach the path, they want to get some kind of therapeutic reward, or they want to get some kind of psychological or psychosomatic reward. They want to feel better about themselves, be more confident. They want to feel healthier, be able to breathe easier. They want to be less stressed out. They want their nervous system to be more relaxed. They want to get better sleep. There's many, kind of, in some ways, simple rewards, which may not, seem like a small deal for somebody who's plagued with stress, plagued with anxiety, plagued with mental health issues. And then, for the spiritual path to help them with that, yes, of course, that's a beautiful thing. But that's not really what spirituality is meant for. There are other things that can do those things as well, and sometimes they can do them much better, right? Such as actually getting, professional help and getting therapy and really making a commitment to work through some of those issues. If you want to physically feel better, well, meditation can help, but going to the gym can help too. A diet can help. Lifestyle changes can help. That's not the specific thing that the spiritual traditions focus on. The spiritual traditions are ultimately about exploring the sacred, expanding our horizons into different aspects of life, more profound and spiritual aspects of life, more incorporeal aspects of life. And ultimately, as we talk about all the time on this channel, spirituality is about self-knowledge, about self-realization. While it's really nice sometimes to get some of those other auxiliary benefits and side effects of spiritual practice, regular disciplined spiritual practice in our life, all of that is really meant to lay the ground for what's meant to be a much deeper and richer experience to human life itself and all the complexities and really innate sacredness of human life. So if we're approaching our practices in a way that itself is kind of deprived of that sacred element by being incredibly body-driven, being very self-oriented, even if it's really good things for yourself. If you yourself are the driving force, you want the reward of your practice, and you're ranking your practices, you're giving them, in a sense, almost monetizing them based on how much time you're going to put in, what kind of reward are you going to get, ranking things according to which reward you want. And more or less, you're putting yourself in control of the entire thing. It is about you. You're in control of it. You're in charge of how much you do. You're in charge of what reward you think you're going to get. If you practice in this way, you're just going to get very kind of simple effects from your practice that in no way properly reflect the entirety, the totality, the grandeur, the ineffability of many different aspects of the spiritual tradition. Instead, spirituality, as we see in all the shastras, all the scriptures, the spiritual tradition is meant to be essentially selfless. It's meant to help us annihilate the self, to cultivate virtue, to expand our horizons so much that we begin to actually disappear, right? That we begin to kind of dissolve into that vast expanse of reality so that we can experience reality the way that it is, as opposed to making our entire spiritual path succumb to the way that we think reality is. So if we approach our entire spiritual path from a point of view that itself is incredibly ignorant, filled with ignorance, we're going to get ignorant results back from it. And so we're never going to be able to cut through our own ignorance, which is what spiritual practice is really about, is cutting through our ignorance. One of the things that we do when we have this relationship to the path, this incredibly mundane relationship to the path, is since we ourselves become the centerpiece of the whole thing, right? We want the reward. We want to be the ones that are doing it. We want to be in control of it. We end up ranking everything, whether we realize we're doing it consciously or not. We create a kind of ranking system of teachers and lineages and techniques, and we try to, in some ways, evaluate and give value to these different techniques and traditions based on how much time we have. And we treat it almost like we would a career, like we would a job, where we try to see, okay, well, what kind of long-term benefits am I going to get? What kind of short-term benefits am I going to get? And all of these ideas are being driven by a sense of self that may not actually stand up to any investigation, right? When you actually dive deeply into the matter of even if there is an independent self, you can end up in kind of a philosophic and spiritual gray area where you realize it's even quite hard to establish yourself as an independent entity, let alone to use that what may be imaginary independent entity as a basis for determining the value of different spiritual traditions and deciding for yourself which path is the best or which is going to be the most effective. This is really just completely wrong way of approaching the whole issue. All the different spiritual paths and methods and techniques, many of them are very beautiful. Many of the paths are very beautiful. Many of the teachers have rich spiritual traditions behind them that are able to help you. And it's more about how you approach those methods than is the methods themselves. I have time and time again come across people who, convinced that they learned the technique that they did because they feel totally confident this is the best technique in the world. Their guru is the best. Their technique is the best. Everybody else has something subpar. This creates an incredible sense of separation, of exclusivity, similar to what you see with religious ideologies or anything else of the sort, that really has nothing to do with spirituality. That's all just ego. And then they practice and practice and practice, and they don't get any results. Meanwhile, somebody who's just sitting there chanting the name of God over and over, and they don't have a teacher, and they don't have special techniques, may be soaring spiritually. But this person over here with all their little special techniques and high-level initiations, and they paid $1,000 for that technique, $1,000 for this technique, $2,000 for that technique, and they've just been duped because they approached all these techniques, even though the techniques may be beautiful. They approached them in a completely mundane way, practiced them in a mundane way, and really are expecting mundane results, and so they get mundane results. One of the foremost issues that I see all the time in modern spirituality, and having been a part of many different spiritual circles myself, is this issue of kind of almost like a propaganda campaign that different spiritual communities have, where they really promulgate this sense that their method is the best, their tradition is the best, their teacher is the best, their technique is the best. And what it does is it placates this kind of nasty, poisonous need of people that people have to be right. Everybody wants to be right. They want to be the most right. It's not enough to be right. People want to be the most right. They want to be more right than that person over there, more right than that person over there. They want to feel like they have the best technique. They want to feel like they have the best guru. This allows them to look down on other people, to look down even on other gurus who themselves may be far more realized, far more attained. Yet, because, well, it's not my guru, it's not my technique, we have something special, we're part of something exclusive. This kind of exclusivity, please pay heed to this, is a poison. Exclusivity, generally in most of its forms, is a poison, and it seeps in slowly. And it gradually destroys and kills all these beautiful things about a tradition, about a path, about having a teacher, all of which can be a cause of incredible joy and celebration and really unique spiritual experiences. And then it gets in there and destroys it all and turns it into something ugly. And that sense of exclusivity, of privilege, can turn even beautiful techniques and beautiful lineages into something completely ugly. But unfortunately, it's almost become a kind of marketing campaign, right? Because you have to, and the teachers have promulgated this. The gurus have actually taken advantage of this themselves. They saw that, over the last century, many of the Western practitioners have an incredibly mundane, materialistic way of approaching the path. And instead of trying to change that, because everybody just wanted to be popular, all the gurus wanted to be super gurus after the 50s and 60s, and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and these other, Osho, these huge names. Everybody wanted to be, the multi-million-dollar, the multi-billion-dollar guru. And so it became about marketing and branding, and instead of really about changing what was a wrong way of looking at the path. Instead of having mercy on the Western practitioners and wanting to actually change the way that they thought about the path into something that was actually effective and proper and spiritual and sacred, instead they placated to it, because Westerners said, show me the money. They said, I need the biggest bang for my buck possible. Why am I going to learn from you when this fellow over here is saying that he's more enlightened than you? I'm going to go learn from that person. And then this person pops up and says, well, I have a better technique than them. So then you want to learn from that person. And what ended up happening is a bunch of spiritual teachers and authorities, I don't know whether they meant to or not, became the slaves of the demands of a bunch of Western disciples and modern disciples who needed to feel that from some kind of monetary perspective, they had monetized spirituality, given spiritual practice a value that it's never meant to have, and a relative value. And then use that to try to make the teachers argue with each other, almost like playing a game, like being controlled, to argue with each other over who was the best teacher, who had the best technique, who had the best traditions. And in the process, they made the whole thing look idiotic. They made their traditions look idiotic. They demoralized and debased themselves, and they sold themselves out to whichever group of students were willing to buy into what they were selling. And this became what a lot of spirituality was about. And unfortunately, it's still taking place constantly. This kind of free market spirituality that's happening, it's ruining a lot of beautiful aspects of the path. What we've been talking about so far has, for the most part, been fairly unique to modern spirituality. And I think it's just a natural issue of, even if it had been thousands of years ago, if most of your students, of your spiritual teacher, and most of your students are householders, and therefore having to deal with a mundane way of life every single day in order to make a living, to support their family, to support their household, naturally they're going to take some of that way of thinking and apply it to their path, even on accident, because it's the main way they know to think about it. They're not renunciants living in the woods. They're not monastics living under the guidance of abbots every single day. And so as a result of that flavor of kind of that mundane approach, that spiritual materialism, begins to seep into even their practices and the way that they pursue the spiritual path. That's kind of what we've been, looking at hitherto, which I think is partly just due to the issue of most spiritual practitioners being householders now. But there's another issue which is very old, and in fact it goes as far back as the spiritual tradition does. All the earliest teachings, things even in the Upanishads, teachings from the Buddha, teachings from great beings like Shankar and Goraksha and others. This is a regular recurring theme in all the spiritual traditions of the world, East or West, is the problem of fixation on reward. And this is actually a form of spiritual materialism, a form of a kind of economic way of thinking, again, where like there's an investment, your money is going somewhere, you're putting in labor, you're putting in work, and you want to get your paycheck. Whether it's actual money or it's, some kind of monetized spirituality you've come up with in your head, where this much of this technique is worth this much of spirituality, this much spiritual reward, this much spiritual realization. No matter how you do it, it's an incredibly mundane and economic way of pursuing the spiritual path. But it's a very old way of thinking about it, because it's, at least this issue itself, isn't something that's unique to the modern era of practitioners. This is something that's actually part of human nature. We intensely believe ourselves to be the doer of all of our activities, and we believe ourselves to be the one who receives the reward of all of our activities. And from the spiritual perspective, even more importantly, and this is one of the most problematic issues, we believe that we are responsible for the reward of our actions. That when we do something and the reward comes, this is because of us. This is, kind of that typical thing even in Christianity where they say, when everything goes right in your life, you blame yourself. But when things go wrong in your life, you blame God. It's the same kind of mindset, right? That if something happens really well, we believe ourselves to be the cause of it. And this, which is called karmiya mala in Vedic tradition, and particularly in the northern tradition of Kashmir and Abhinav Gupta and the Tantrikas, they have a term for this, which is karmiya mala, the sense that you're the doer. This is actually at the root of all, mundane ways of thinking about the path. So you can think about the path in an incredibly mundane way, even if you're a renunciant, even if you're a monk. You can still have this sense of the performer, the action, and the reward. And this is why so many scriptures are actually dedicated to dealing with this issue, because upon investigation, it doesn't really hold to be that true. And in fact, if you look at your life, you'll see most things in your life did not happen the way you thought they would. Some things may have happened radically different than the way that you thought they would. You might even try to do something as simple as go to the grocery store, which you may feel you have total control over. Yet maybe there's an accident on the way, maybe there's a traffic jam, maybe things get rerouted, maybe you get there and the grocery store is closed for the day. There's endless things that can happen that can completely obstruct what you felt was going to be a very simple thing that you're in control of, right? You want to go to the grocery store, you can go. You want to get up and take a walk, you can take a walk in the neighborhood, and nothing eventful should happen. Yet in reality, life doesn't really happen this way. So there's a connection, a psychological connection. The Buddhists call this the interlinking of thoughts. There's a way that the human brain links cause and effect that, for various reasons, spiritual masters throughout history have found to be problematic. And on a practical level, part of it is undoubtedly because it's an ego-driven idea. It's a sense that I am doing what I'm doing for my own sake. And since the spiritual path is about annihilating the ego, it's about annihilating the sense of self and expanding it into something greater. Obviously, a very self-driven sense of reward, right? If you believe yourself to be the doer and the one who receives the reward, this becomes, even if it's enlightenment, even if the reward is enlightenment, it becomes a very selfish way of thinking about the path, a very selfish way of approaching the path. And this itself is really the oldest form of this kind of, having a mundane, ignorant mindset of approaching the spiritual path. I think, it comes sometimes likened to the analogy of mixing poison in with a medicine. Right, where the spiritual path itself is a medicine. But if you mix your ego up in it, it doesn't matter how powerful a medicine you may have. You might have the best doctor, you might have the best herbs and the best ingredients, but if there's poison mixed into it that's contaminated the medicine, it's not going to heal you. And this is what this mindset does. When we become incredibly fixated on our reward, when we become incredibly fixated on an ego-driven, a self-driven sense of spiritual development and practice, we get stuck within the same psychological complexes, within the same psychological assumptions. There's many actual kind of pitfalls we fall into when we do that. One of them, for example, is if we're fixated on the reward, it means that we believe ourselves to know what the reward will be. Say if it's enlightenment, If we're fixated on getting enlightenment as a reward from a technique, it must on some level imply we know what enlightenment is. But if you're unenlightened, then you don't know what enlightenment is. And so that fixation on something is ignorance leading to ignorance, as opposed to ignorance leading to knowledge. And this and many other, examples like this end up demonstrating some of the issues that happen when we have this approach. Spirituality is meant to even tantric practices that deal a lot with energy and bliss and things that seem like there's a lot of pleasure in them, there's a lot of personal satisfaction in them, are really meant to kind of loosen up the energy channels, loosen up the aura, loosen up different aspects of the subtle anatomy, the subtle bodies, so that you can expand your sense of self more easily, connect more easily to things like the moon, the stars, the sun, the changing of the seasons, some of these subtler impulses in life, some of these subtler life energies. All of these problems we've been talking about are exaggerated by what we can kind of call the modern spiritual marketplace, which is something that maybe to some extent, in some very weak, watered down way, always was there, always existed in some way, but has really reached a level of nonsense, a level of idiocy in today's world that has totally derailed a lot of things in the spiritual path. And this is partly, like I said earlier, partly because some of the earlier spiritual teachers who were coming to the West and teaching in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the 20th century were having to kind of placate the way of looking at life, the intense need to give value to everything that Americans and other Western cultures, that was how they thought about things. And so the different gurus and teachers who were coming over were likewise trying to pin a value to things. They're trying to figure out, okay, well, this is the way they think, so how do we show them that this is a really worthwhile, valuable technique or a worthwhile, valuable idea? Because at the time, and really still in a lot of ways, there's this sense that something's worth, something's value does have a monetary reflection. And so if it's a technique that's incredibly important, one of the best ways you can show your commitment to that technique or to that teacher is to kick out some money for it. And you have to understand, I feel like there's no issue whatsoever with spiritual teacher making a living from what they're doing. I don't have a problem with anybody who is a professional and well-trained and educated and spent years of their life becoming incredible at something, at honing a certain set of skills. I have no problem with anyone like that, and whether it's spiritual or not, being able to make a living. And in fact, if you're a student, a spiritual student, and aspiring on the path, you want to have a teacher who's able to give you a full-time commitment as a teacher, not someone who has to work a full-time job somewhere else and then in their spare time try to figure out how to teach a few people, right? Most people, if you're a spiritual practitioner and disciple, you want to have a teacher who's a full-time teacher. And in order for them to be a full-time teacher, well, they need to be able to make a living off of it, especially if they're householders. So I have no problem with that whatsoever. What I think there is a problem with is to the extent that this has been blown up, right? The idea of like too much of something, even if it's okay, and in excess, many things become bad, become negative. And I think this is what's happened with this idea where the spiritual path has really become about marketing, about branding, about value, monetary value, where even, unfortunately, so many people now feel like they can't even afford to go to any of their teachers' classes. They can't afford to learn any of the spiritual techniques. They can't afford to go to a retreat or workshop, which is kind of an awful situation to be in. And it's one that so many people today can resonate with. And it's partly because of this kind of bloated marketplace of spirituality where these gurus, first I think they were almost forced to do it early on, but now it seems like it's the other way around. They're out there peddling their wares, and their wares are their techniques. And in the process, even though the root of the idea was that, well, by giving them a good monetary value, Westerners will think that they have immense purpose, that they have good meaning, that, if I give something a lot of value, I can show it's worth it, that it's important. And I realize that's kind of the root of the idea. But now it's gotten so exaggerated, it's become such an issue that it does the exact opposite and takes value away from the technique, because it makes it seem now that the spiritual path is all about money too. And this reaffirms a lot of ideas of people who don't believe in spirituality, don't believe in spiritual practice, don't believe there's life after death or anything more to life, that life is about money. And then they see all the gurus and everybody going out making $1 million, and they think, see, even your teachers think life is about money, right? Even the spiritual path seems to be obviously proving life is just about money. And so what began, I think, as an honest attempt by some early teachers coming to the West in the 20th century to speak the language of Westerners by giving a decent monetary price on and to show that all their techniques were valuable. What began as a kind of nice, honest push to do this has now done the exact opposite, and it's taken away credibility and taken away that sense of deep, meaningful value in the spiritual path and in the spiritual traditions. And unfortunately, a lot of people are still being duped by this whole thing, by this whole issue of marketplace. They follow spiritual teachers based on their branding, based on their marketing, and the teachers themselves follow this. And in the process, it ends up actually taking a lot of credibility out of the whole thing and causes way more harm, ultimately, to the longevity of the spiritual path in the modern world than anything else does. So what do we do about all of this? Right? What do we do to kind of keep this mundane attitude, not just from poisoning our personal daily practice and our personal relationship to the spiritual path, but from poisoning the entirety of spirituality, right? How do we keep this issue from killing spirituality, or at least, how do we make it so that our spirituality is going to die anyways? We let it die with some integrity. We let it die with some nobility. Because I think that first we have to recognize the seriousness of this issue. People are being turned away from spirituality because of the incredibly mundane way, not just that practitioners pursue it, but the way that the teachers themselves end up marketing and presenting the path. And as a result of this, even though it creates short-term explosions in popularity of different teachers and different methods, there's a growing number of people turning away from those things and never returning to them. And there's a growing number of people never even trying it out because they're feeling more and more like the whole thing is just a show. The whole thing's just a marketplace. The whole thing's about money. And eventually, I think long-term, 20, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years down the road, all these things could do so much damage to problems of spirituality that it no longer enjoys anywhere near the popularity that it now does, and instead kind of returns back to being a much more small circle, more private, more secretive thing, which is in some ways against the values of spirituality, because spiritual tradition is about helping people, saving people, and in order to do that, it needs to reach as many people as possible. And if it's going to reach as many people as possible, it should reach them in a way that's full of integrity, right? That's full of nobility. And that actually, in a way that it resembles its own self, that it resembles its own values. It seems ridiculous to teach spirituality in a way that is contrary to the values of the spiritual tradition in every single culture, in every single religion, and every single lineage possible. And more I see that this is happening. So I think first we have to recognize it as an issue, not just within our own practice of approaching our practice in a mundane way, but also of encouraging this sideshow, this kind of circus that's now happening in spirituality as a whole through our mundane attitude, of taking this attitude not just from our practice, but into our lineage, into our relationship with our teachers, so that even the lineages and the teachers end up being shaped according to it and placating it. And in some ways, I think at first they were just suffering it, but now it's become such an issue where even they themselves are caught up in that mundane attitude, and they're kind of peddling their own spirituality and techniques. One of the main things that you can do about this is to just not be duped by the whole thing, right? The spiritual path isn't about branding, so you shouldn't care how good someone's branding is, how great their appearance is, how long their beard is, how nice their little one-line witticisms and axioms are, because that has nothing to do with spirituality, right? Secondly, don't allow yourself to play a part necessarily so much in thinking that the entire spiritual path can be given a monetary value. Certainly, if money is what you have to trade with, right, and money is the way that you can show appreciation, money is the way that you can support a lineage, the way you can support a teacher's teaching activities, the way you can support maybe their endless charities and nonprofits, if that's the easiest way for you to support it, that's fine. Support it that way. Okay? But understand it's supply and demand, right? The cost reflects that. The continually escalating prices of different spiritual retreats and workshops and things of that sort are only because people keep paying it, right? If people weren't paying it, it wouldn't be an issue. It's only because people keep doing it because they get so wrapped up in the hype and the advertising and the marketing and the branding, and they feel that they're going to be incredibly special if they learn these techniques. They're going to be incredibly important, that maybe before they weren't important, but now that they met this person, they met this woman or this man, they part of this tradition, now they're incredibly important. That is a stupidly mundane way of thinking about the path. And again, you're just going to get mundane results out of it. You're going to get mundane results out of your relationship with your teacher, out of your relationship with your path, out of your tradition, and out of your techniques. And you might pay, thousands of dollars for a technique or a mantra. Meanwhile, this little fellow sitting on the Ganga River somewhere in India, with no education, no big teachers, and just nothing but the name of, of Lord Krishna or Lord Ram on his lips, is going to achieve way higher levels of experience and realization than you're ever going to get from all your complicated techniques that you spent thousands of dollars on. So part of the issue is if you stop being duped by the whole process, right, then maybe eventually a decade down the road, 2 or 3 decades down the road, some of these other spiritual teachers themselves will now have to shift the way that they teach and the way that they present the teachings in a way that is a little bit more in line with some of the core themes and trends and principles of the spiritual path on the whole. Normally, we try to focus a little bit more on central issues for individual spiritual practitioners, or kind of themes, philosophic themes of the path, and just some, some interesting subjects to study. But I felt that every now and then we have to do a video like this where we look at some issues that are plaguing modern spirituality right now as it exists as a kind of institution in the world and the way people approach it, because it's not enough to just think about our own path, our own practice, or even just our own life. We have to think in some ways, as spiritual practitioners, can we pursue the spiritual path in a way that does justice to the path itself, that holds the different teachers of the path accountable to the principles of the path, so that the path outlives us, so that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people can still come to the spiritual path, they can still learn from great teachers, they still have access to great traditions, and these things haven't been, destroyed or lost their credibility from a whole century of being abused. So hopefully you found this, today's episode interesting and the subject interesting. If you liked the video, please make sure to press like and subscribe to the channel so that you can keep up with all of our new content each week. Thank you.